Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally are the ones who deliver the cruelest blows. The moment when everything you thought you knew about your place in the world shatters in an instant, and you're left standing in the wreckage wondering how you'll ever put the pieces back together. This is the story of how betrayal became the unexpected catalyst for transformation, and how the darkest moment became the doorway to a life beyond anything that seemed possible. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The impact came without warning. One moment, life felt predictable, manageable, contained within familiar boundaries. The next, everything exploded into chaos that rewrote the rules of existence in a single, brutal instant. The confrontation started like so many others had before, with tension crackling in the air and voices beginning to rise. But this time felt different. There was a finality in the atmosphere, a sense that whatever happened next would leave permanent scars on everyone involved. The accusations flew fast and sharp, each word designed to cut deeper than the last. Words have power, but silence has weight. The moment of pause before everything erupted felt endless, like standing on the edge of a cliff knowing the ground was about to give way. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Not shouted, not screamed, but delivered with cold, calculated precision that made it impossible to misunderstand or dismiss. The physical blow, when it came, was almost secondary to the emotional. Devastation that had already been unleashed, the sharp crack of contact, the disorientation, the way the world tilted and spun before solid ground returned. But pain has a way of clarifying things, of stripping away illusions and leaving only raw truth behind. Standing there, vision blurred and ears ringing, the full scope of the betrayal became crystal clear. This wasn't anger speaking, or temporary frustration that would fade with time and apologies. This was judgment, final and absolute. This was the moment when belonging became exile, when family became strangers, when home became a place that no longer existed. The voices echoed with a united front that felt rehearsed, as if this moment had been planned, anticipated, maybe even hoped for. Each person present added their own layer of rejection, their own confirmation that there would be no coming back from this, no forgiveness, no second chances. The demand came next, delivered with the kind of authority that expects immediate compliance. Pack up. Get out. Find somewhere else to exist because this space, this life, this identity was being revoked. The timeline was immediate, the conditions non-negotiable, the finality absolute. Standing in that room, surrounded by people who had once represented safety and unconditional love, the transformation began in that very instant. Not the healing transformation that would come later, but the brutal dismantling of everything that had defined identity up to that point. The person who had walked into that room no longer existed. What remained was something raw, wounded, but strangely liberated from expectations that had never really fit anyway. The packing happened in a daze, mechanical movements guided by shock rather than clear thinking. Each item placed in the bag represented another connection being severed, another piece of the old life being left behind. Some things were abandoned by choice, others by necessity, but everything that remained had to fit into whatever could be carried alone. The final moments in that space felt surreal, like sleepwalking through someone else's nightmare. The familiar, surroundings that had witnessed years of life suddenly felt foreign, hostile, eager to be rid of the unwelcome presence that lingered too long in doorways and corners. The walk to the door stretched forever and ended too soon. Each step forward was irreversible, each inch of distance a declaration that there would be no turning back. The handle turned, the threshold was crossed, and suddenly the safety of inside became the uncertainty of outside, with no plan, no destination, no safety net waiting. The door closed with a sound that seemed to echo through the darkness, a punctuation mark ending one chapter and beginning another. Standing there in the cold night air, with nothing but a bag and the clothes on their back, the full weight of what had just happened began to settle in. This was rock bottom. This was the moment when everything familiar was stripped away, when all the safety nets disappeared, when the only choice left was to discover what lay beneath all the comfortable assumptions about how life was supposed to work. The old life was over, but the new one hadn't begun yet. This was the space between, where transformation either happens or people disappear forever. The first step into that unknown darkness was also the first step toward becoming someone entirely new. The cracks had been forming for years, invisible. Hairline fractures and what everyone assumed was solid ground. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere, hidden in plain sight like clues to a mystery no one wanted to solve. But foundations don't collapse overnight. They erode slowly, one small compromise at a time, until the weight of accumulated damage becomes too much to bear. It started with subtle shifts in atmosphere, the kind of changes that happen so gradually they feel normal until someone points them out. Conversations that used to flow naturally began requiring more effort, more careful navigation around topics that suddenly felt dangerous. Laughter became less frequent, replaced by polite smiles that never quite reached the eyes. The easy comfort of unconditional acceptance slowly transformed into the constant awareness of being evaluated, measured, found wanting. The dynamics had always been complex, but complexity had once felt manageable, even interesting. Different personalities, different priorities, different visions of how things should work. These differences had created texture, depth, the kind of creative tension that can strengthen relationships when handled with care and mutual respect. But somewhere along the way, difference became division, and division hardened into opposing. Camp's power struggles emerged disguised as practical discussions. Decisions that once would have been made collectively began happening behind closed doors, with affected parties informed rather than consulted. The language changed too, shifting from collaborative language to hierarchical directives. Questions were discouraged, suggestions dismissed, and dissent treated as disloyalty rather than healthy disagreement. The gaslighting was masterful in its subtlety. Memories were questioned, perceptions challenged, reality itself became negotiable depending on who was telling the story. Events that had seemed clear-cut were reframed as misunderstandings. Reactions that felt justified were labeled as overreactions. And patterns of behavior were dismissed as isolated incidents with perfectly reasonable explanations. Trust eroded through 1,000 small betrayals that individually seemed too minor to address, but collectively created an atmosphere of constant vigilance. Confidences shared in vulnerable moments were later weaponized in arguments. Promises made were quietly broken with elaborate justifications. Support that had once felt reliable became conditional on maintaining perfect compliance with ever-changing expectations. The isolation was perhaps the most insidious element of all. Relationships with others were carefully monitored and subtly discouraged through scheduling conflicts, last-minute emergencies, and gentle suggestions that certain people weren't really good influences anyway. The world gradually became smaller, more controlled, more dependent on the approval and validation of those who held the power to grant or withdraw their acceptance. Personal growth was encouraged only within very specific parameters. Achievements were celebrated when they reflected well on the group, but quickly minimized when they threatened to shift the balance of power or attention. Independent thinking was praised in theory but punished in practice through cold shoulders, withdrawn affection, and increasingly frequent reminders about gratitude and loyalty. Financial control was always framed as protection or practical necessity. Joint accounts made sense for efficiency. Shared resources were simpler to manage. Individual financial independence was portrayed as selfish, even dangerous. Every purchase became a negotiation. Every expense a potential source of conflict. Every desire for autonomy, a betrayal of collective values. Communication became a minefield where words were parsed for hidden meanings and motivations were constantly questioned. Honest expressions of concern were reframed as attacks. Requests for clarification were treated as accusations. The simple act of stating preferences or boundaries was met with hurt feelings and elaborate explanations about how such selfishness affected everyone else. The most devastating realization was how carefully the narrative had been constructed to make resistance seem unreasonable. Every grievance had a counter-explanation. Every complaint was met with examples of kindness and generosity that made criticism feel ungrateful. The gaslighting was so complete that questioning the situation felt like questioning reality itself. The outside world became increasingly distant as energy was consumed by the constant effort required to maintain peace within the inner circle. Friendships atrophied from neglect, opportunities were declined to avoid conflict, and dreams were quietly shelved to maintain the illusion of harmony that everyone knew was already broken. Looking back, the most tragic element wasn't the malicious intent, but the genuine belief among all parties that they were protecting something valuable. Everyone was convinced they were the reasonable one, the one making sacrifices for the greater good, the one being patient with everyone else's unreasonable demands and emotional volatility. The slow erosion of personal agency happened so gradually that by the time it became obvious, the foundation was already too damaged to repair. What had once felt like belonging had become imprisonment. What had seemed like love had revealed itself as control, and what everyone had fought so hard to preserve was already lost. The explosion, when it finally came, wasn't really a surprise to anyone involved. It was simply the inevitable conclusion to a process that had been building momentum for years. The foundation had been cracked for so long that collapse was the only remaining option. The discovery came at the worst possible moment, as these things always do. Not during a calm conversation where explanations might have been possible. Not in a private setting where damage could be contained. But in the middle of ordinary life when defenses were down and pretenses had been temporarily set aside. It started with something small, something that shouldn't have mattered. A misplaced item, an unexpected phone call, a conversation overheard through a partially open door. The kind of random occurrence that normally passes without significance, but sometimes serves as the key that unlocks doors everyone had agreed to keep closed. The initial reaction was denial, that automatic response that protects the mind from processing information too devastating to immediately accept. There had to be a reasonable explanation, a misunderstanding, a context that would make everything make sense again. The brain scrambled to construct alternative narratives, anything that would preserve the carefully maintained illusion that everything was still manageable. But evidence has a way of accumulating once you know where to look. One revelation led to another, each discovery adding weight to a conclusion that became harder to avoid with each passing moment. The timeline began to clarify, dates and events that had seemed unrelated suddenly forming a pattern that told a story no one wanted to acknowledge. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and brutal in its efficiency. No time for careful explanations or diplomatic solutions, no opportunity to control the narrative or manage the fallout. The truth, once exposed, demanded immediate response from everyone involved, and those responses revealed character in ways that normal circumstances never could. Some people, when caught, double down on deception even when the evidence is overwhelming. Others become aggressive, attacking the messenger rather than addressing the message. A few rare individuals take responsibility, but most retreat into justifications and blame shifting that makes the original betrayal seem almost minor by comparison. Most shocking revelations often come not from enemies, but from allies who suddenly reveal where their true loyalties lie. People who had seemed supportive, understanding, even protective, quickly reposition themselves to avoid being associated with whatever consequences were about to unfold. Fair-weather friends revealed their true nature with a speed that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so devastating. The speed at which alliances shifted was breathtaking. Conversations that had happened in confidence were suddenly being shared with anyone who would listen, but with details conveniently altered to protect the storyteller's reputation. History was being rewritten in real time, with everyone scrambling to position themselves on the winning side of whatever battle was about to be fought. The isolation was immediate and comprehensive. Phone calls went unreturned, invitations stopped. Arriving and casual encounters became awkward exercises in avoiding eye contact. The social network that had seemed so solid revealed itself to be a house of cards that collapsed the moment any real pressure was applied. Professional consequences followed personal ones with devastating efficiency. Opportunities that had seemed secure suddenly evaporated. Projects were reassigned without explanation, and future prospects dimmed as word spread through networks that operated on reputation and relationships rather than documented facts. Lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The most brutal realization was how quickly the narrative was established and accepted by people who had no direct knowledge of what had actually happened. The story spread like wildfire, gaining embellishments and losing nuance with each retelling, until the truth became completely unrecognizable beneath layers of speculation and bias. Legal implications began to surface as what had started as personal drama escalated into formal disputes over contracts, commitments, and consequences. Lawyers were consulted, documents were reviewed, and the possibility of litigation hung over every interaction like a sword waiting to fall. The financial impact was immediate and severe. Income streams that had seemed reliable disappeared overnight. Shared resources became contested territory, and the cost of defending against accusations began to mount even before any formal legal proceedings began. The psychological warfare was perhaps the most exhausting element of all. Every interaction became a strategic consideration. Every word was analyzed for hidden meanings, and the constant stress of being under siege began to take its toll on physical health as well as mental well-being. Sleep became elusive, interrupted, by racing thoughts and worst-case scenarios that played on endless loop. Appetite disappeared, replaced by a constant knot of anxiety that made food seem irrelevant. The body began to show the strain of sustained stress in ways that couldn't be hidden or ignored. The point of no return wasn't a single moment, but a series of escalating commitments that made retreat impossible for anyone involved. Each side had invested too much, revealed too much, and committed too publicly to their version of events to back down without losing everything they had fought to protect. By the time the dust settled, bridges weren't just burned, they were obliterated so completely that rebuilding would require starting from scratch in entirely new territory. The old life, the old relationships, the old identity were officially over, leaving nothing but scorched earth and the daunting prospect of building something entirely new from whatever remained. Rock bottom has a strange quality of clarity that comes only when there's literally nowhere left to fall. The absence of options creates a peculiar kind of freedom, the liberty that emerges when you have nothing left to lose and no reputation left to protect. The fear of hitting bottom disappears once you're already there, replaced by something unexpected. The solid ground needed to start building again. The first nights were the hardest, not because of physical discomfort, but because of the silence. When you're used to constant conflict, chaos, and crisis management, peace feels unnatural, almost threatening. The brain, accustomed to hypervigilance, struggles to adjust to an environment where every shadow isn't hiding a new catastrophe waiting to unfold. Survival becomes surprisingly straightforward when stripped of complexity. Food, shelter, safety. The hierarchy of needs reveals itself with mathematical precision. The elaborate social structures that had seemed so important just days before fade into irrelevance when measured against the simple question of where to sleep tonight and what to eat tomorrow. The kindness of strangers often comes from unexpected sources. Not from the people you might expect, those with obvious resources or social connections, but from individuals who recognize the look of someone who has nowhere else to turn. These encounters are brief, practical, lacking sentimentality, but they carry a weight that grand gestures from secure people never could. The first offer of help comes without strings attached, without questions about what led to this situation, or judgments about choices that resulted in such circumstances. Just simple human recognition that everyone is a few bad decisions or unlucky breaks away from needing exactly the same assistance. The work, when it's offered, is humble but dignified, not charity disguised as employment, but genuine opportunity to contribute something useful in exchange for fair compensation. The tasks might be simple: cleaning, organizing, basic maintenance, but they provide structure to days that would otherwise be consumed by worry and regret. Learning to accept help without shame becomes its own education. Pride, it turns out, is a luxury that homeless people can't afford. The ego that had been so carefully constructed and fiercely defended becomes irrelevant when basic survival requires swallowing that pride daily and asking for assistance from people who owe you nothing. The community that emerges in these circumstances is unlike anything experienced in more comfortable settings. Bonds form quickly based on shared vulnerability rather than shared interests or backgrounds. People who would never have crossed paths in normal circumstances become allies, offering practical advice and emotional support without the complex social calculations that govern interactions in more privileged circles. The resourcefulness that poverty demands reveals capabilities that prosperity never required. Learning to stretch a dollar until it screams, to make meals from ingredients others would discard, to repair things that wealthier people would simply replace. These skills build confidence in ways that previous achievements never could, because they represent pure competence uncomplicated by external validation. The rhythm of days becomes dictated by necessity rather than preference, creating a structure that's both limiting and liberating. No energy wasted on decisions that don't matter, no time spent on activities that don't contribute to immediate well-being. The focus narrows to what's essential, filtering out the noise that had previously seemed so important. The first glimpse of possibility comes not as a grand vision, but as a small realization. This situation is temporary, not permanent. The skills being learned, the connections being made, the resilience being developed, these are assets that can be built upon, foundations for something better than what came before. The mentor figure who emerges isn't necessarily someone with great wisdom or resources, but someone who has walked a similar path and can offer guidance based on experience rather than theory. Their advice is practical, tested, stripped of the platitudes that comfortable people offer to those in crisis. The turning point arrives quietly, not announced with fanfare, but recognized only in retrospect. A moment when the focus shifts from simply surviving each day to actually planning for tomorrow. When thoughts extend beyond immediate needs to longer-term possibilities. When the conversation changes from, how do I get through this, to what do I want to build? The identity that emerges from this process is fundamentally different from the one that was destroyed. Stronger in some ways, more realistic in others, but undeniably authentic in ways that the previous version never was. The pretenses have been stripped away, the false supports removed, leaving only what's genuinely substantial. The gratitude that develops isn't the shallow thankfulness of someone who's never really suffered, but the deep appreciation of someone who understands how quickly everything can change. Every meal tastes better when you remember being hungry. Every roof feels more secure when you remember sleeping outdoors. Every act of kindness carries more weight when you remember being ignored. The foundation being built this time is different, not based on external validation or social positioning, but on genuine competence and authentic relationships with people who see clearly because they've been stripped of illusions themselves. The rebuilding phase lacks the dramatic intensity of destruction or the inspiring moments of breakthrough. It's characterized instead by the relentless repetition of small actions that accumulate slowly into something substantial. Progress measured in inches rather than miles. Victories so modest they barely register as wins until viewed from a distance. The daily routine becomes sacred, not because it's particularly meaningful, but because consistency provides the scaffolding around which a new life can be constructed. Same wake-up time, same sequence of tasks, same commitment to showing up regardless of motivation or mood. The routine creates structure where chaos once reigned, predictability where uncertainty had dominated. Skills develop through necessity rather than choice. Learning to manage money when every dollar counts, developing time management when every hour matters. Building communication abilities when clear expression determines whether opportunities open or close. These competencies emerge from pressure rather than passion, but they prove more durable than skills acquired in comfortable circumstances. Education happens everywhere except classrooms. Street wisdom from people who've survived worse circumstances. Practical knowledge from mentors who've built something from nothing. Technical skills from whatever work is available. The curriculum is dictated by immediate needs rather than long-term planning, but it creates a foundation more solid than any theoretical framework. Networking takes on new meaning when you're starting from zero. Instead of strategic relationship building, designed to advance existing careers, connections form around mutual assistance and shared struggles. These relationships lack the superficial polish of professional networking, but carry the weight of genuine interdependence and authentic respect. The first small business venture emerges from desperation rather than inspiration. Not a grand entrepreneurial vision, but a simple recognition that there's something needed that isn't being provided, some gap in the market that can be filled with available resources and emerging skills. The scale is tiny, the margins thin, but the control is complete. Customer acquisition happens one person at a time through word of mouth rather than marketing campaigns. Quality becomes the only advertising budget available, reputation the only currency that matters. Every interaction carries weight because there's no margin for error, no backup plan if relationships sour or trust is broken. The learning curve is steep and unforgiving. Mistakes cost money that isn't available to lose. Poor decisions create setbacks that take weeks to overcome, and ignorance carries consequences that more privileged entrepreneurs never face. But the education is comprehensive and the lessons stick, because failure isn't just disappointing, it's genuinely dangerous. Financial management becomes an art form when resources are scarce. Every expenditure requires justification. Every investment demands careful analysis. Every risk must be calculated against potential rewards and available safety nets. The discipline developed under these constraints creates habits that persist long after scarcity is no longer an issue. The work ethic that emerges isn't driven by ambition or career advancement, but by the simple recognition that effort directly correlates with survival. No one else is responsible for creating opportunities, solving problems, or ensuring success. The responsibility is total, and the accountability absolute. Innovation becomes essential when conventional approaches are financially impossible. Creative solutions emerge from the intersection of limited resources and unlimited necessity. The constraints that seem like obstacles become catalysts for approaches that more comfortable people would never consider. The community that develops around shared struggle provides support that wealthy networks rarely match. People who understand scarcity offer different kinds of assistance than those who've never experienced genuine need. The help is practical, immediate, and comes without the subtle condescension that often accompanies charity from the privileged. Personal growth happens, whether you want it or not. The old personality traits that don't serve survival get abandoned quickly, while useful characteristics get reinforced through daily necessity. The identity that emerges is less about aspiration and more about what actually works in real-world conditions. The first signs of genuine progress are easy to miss because they're overshadowed by how far there still is to go. A savings account with 3 digits instead of 2, a business that breaks even instead of losing money, relationships that provide mutual benefit instead of one-sided dependency. The improvements are real but modest. The temptation to rush the process creates the biggest risk of setback. The desire to accelerate progress by taking shortcuts, accepting questionable opportunities, or compromising values that have kept things stable. Patience becomes a survival skill rather than a virtue, practiced out of necessity rather than wisdom. The vision of the future begins to take shape not as a restoration of what was lost, but as something entirely new. The person being built through this process has capabilities that the previous version never possessed, relationships that run deeper than social convenience, and values that have been tested under pressure rather than proclaimed in comfort. The most surprising discovery is that the process itself becomes satisfying in ways that easier paths never were. The direct connection between effort and results, the authenticity of relationships forged in difficulty, the self-respect that comes from proving capability under adverse conditions. The struggle, while difficult, creates meaning that prosperity had never provided. The transformation doesn't announce itself with fanfare or dramatic revelations. It becomes apparent gradually, through the accumulation of evidence that the person navigating today's challenges is fundamentally different from the one who was destroyed years earlier. The change is measured not in grand gestures, but in quiet confidence, steady decision-making, and the ability to handle pressure without losing composure. Success, when it finally arrives, looks nothing like the version that was imagined during the darkest nights of rebuilding. The metrics are different, the satisfaction deeper, the foundation more solid than anything constructed during more comfortable times. What was built from necessity proves more durable than what was inherited or given freely. The recognition comes from unexpected sources first. People who had no knowledge of the previous life, no investment in the old story, no preconceptions about what should or shouldn't be possible. They see only the current reality, competence, integrity, results. Their validation carries more weight than praise from those who knew the earlier version. Professional achievement follows personal growth rather than preceding it. The skills developed during survival, the relationships forged through mutual assistance, the character tested under pressure, these assets create opportunities that resume credentials never could. The work feels aligned with identity in ways that previous careers never managed. The financial security that emerges isn't just about numbers in bank accounts, but about the knowledge that it was earned through genuine contribution rather than inherited advantage, or lucky circumstances. Every dollar represents value created, problem solved, people helped. The money carries weight because it was earned by someone who understands its true cost. The community that forms around this new life operates on different principles than the social networks of the past. Relationships are based on mutual respect rather than social positioning. Conversations focus on substance rather than appearance, and support flows naturally because everyone understands the value of genuine assistance during difficult times. The moment of testing arrives without warning, as these moments always do. Not a planned examination, but an unexpected encounter that reveals how complete the transformation has actually been. The past, which had seemed safely contained in memory, suddenly demands a response in the present moment. The messenger appears bearing requests disguised as opportunities for reconciliation. The language is carefully chosen to appeal to compassion, generosity, the better angels of human nature. But underneath the diplomatic phrasing lies the same fundamental dynamic that created the original destruction. The assumption that past wrongs can be erased through present desperation. The requests come wrapped in justifications that attempt to rewrite history, circumstances that supposedly explain previous behavior, external pressures that allegedly forced harmful choices, misunderstandings that can finally be clarified now that emotions have cooled and perspective has been gained. The most revealing element isn't what's asked for, but what isn't offered. No accountability for specific actions, no acknowledgement of lasting consequences, no recognition of the strength required to rebuild from the wreckage they created. The requests focus entirely on their current needs while treating the intervening years of struggle as if they never happened. The decision, when it comes, emerges from clarity rather than emotion. Not anger, not vindictiveness, not even satisfaction, but simply the recognition that some bridges shouldn't be rebuilt. That forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. That healing doesn't demand restored relationships. That moving forward sometimes means leaving the past exactly where it belongs. The response is delivered with the calm authority of someone who understands their own worth and isn't seeking approval for their choices. No lengthy explanations, no justifications for boundaries, no attempts to convince others that the decision is reasonable. Simply a clear statement of what will and won't be happening, delivered without apology or negotiation. The aftermath reveals the true measure of transformation. No second-guessing, no guilt about being too harsh, no wondering if forgiveness would have been the bigger choice. Just peace with a decision made from strength rather than weakness, from self-respect rather than people-pleasing, from wisdom rather than wishful thinking. The final test comes in solitude, in the quiet moments when the initial adrenaline of confrontation fades and the mind has space to process what just happened. The old version would have agonized over whether the choice was right, would have replayed conversations searching for different approaches, would have wondered endlessly about roads not taken. Instead, there's simply gratitude. Gratitude for the journey that led to this moment, for the people who provided assistance when it was needed most, for the strength that was discovered in the darkest places, for the life that was built from nothing and belongs completely to the person who created it. The story ends not with dramatic closure, but with quiet continuation. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities, new choices to be made from the solid foundation that was constructed piece by piece through years of patient work. The past has been integrated without being allowed to dictate the present, and the future stretches ahead full of possibilities that the broken person from years ago could never have imagined. The transformation is complete, not because the journey is over, but because the traveler has become someone capable of handling whatever lies ahead. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.